What started as a routine late-night interview turned into television chaos when Quentin Tarantino abruptly walked off Stephen Colbert Show following a heated exchange that left audiences stunned and social media erupting. Late shows studio buzzed with its usual pre-taping energy as crew members made final adjustments to the lighting and cameras. Stephen Colbert sat behind his desk reviewing his note cards one last time before the taping began. Tonight's guest was supposed to be a ratings goldmine. Quentin Tarantino, the legendary filmmaker known for his sharp wit and uncompromising artistic vision, was scheduled to discuss his latest project and reflect on his storied career. The audience settled into their seats, unaware they were about to witness one of the most uncomfortable moments in late-night television history. Colbert's production team had been particularly excited about this booking, seeing it as an opportunity to showcase the host's interviewing prowess with one of Hollywood's most intellectually formidable directors. As the show's familiar opening music played, Colbert delivered his monologue with his characteristic blend of political commentary and humor. Everything seemed normal. The host was in his element, working the crowd with practiced ease. When he introduced Tarantino, the audience erupted in applause, clearly anticipating an engaging conversation between two sharp minds. Tarantino emerged from backstage with his typical confident swagger, dressed in a dark suit that seemed slightly rumpled in that deliberately casual way that had become part of his signature look. He waved to the audience, flashed his crooked smile, and settled into the guest chair with the relaxed, cast demeanor of someone who had done countless interviews over his decades-long career. The conversation began pleasantly enough, with Colbert asking about Tarantino's writing process and his thoughts on the current state of cinema. Tarantino, ever the passionate filmmaker, launched into an animated discussion about the craft of storytelling, gesticulating wildly as he spoke about the importance of authentic dialogue and character development. The audience was engaged, laughing at his colorful anecdotes and nodding along with his insights about the film industry. But the atmosphere began to shift when Colbert steered the conversation toward more controversial territory with a slight smirk that his regular viewers would recognize as a setup for more pointed questioning. Colbert leaned forward and brought up the ongoing debates about violence in cinema and its potential impact on society. It's a topic that had dogged Tarantino throughout his career. Now, Quentin Colbert said, his tone taking on a more serious edge, "You've faced criticism over the years about the level of violence in your films. Some people argue that movies like yours contribute to a culture that normalizes violence. How do you respond to those critics who say you have a responsibility to consider the broader social impact of your work?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and perceptive viewers might have noticed Tarantino's jaw tighten slightly. This wasn't the first time he'd been asked about violence in his films, and he'd grown increasingly frustrated with what he saw as a shallow, reductive approach to discussing his art. His response was measured, but carried an undercurrent of irritation. "Stephen, with all due respect, that's a question that fundamentally misunderstands what cinema is and what artists do." Tarantino replied, his voice remaining calm, but his eyes narrowing. "I'm not a social worker or a politician. I'm a filmmaker. My job is to tell stories that move people, that challenge them, that make them think and feel. The idea that I should water down my artistic vision because some people can't distinguish between fiction and reality is frankly insulting to both my intelligence and theirs." Colbert, perhaps sensing an opportunity to push harder or genuinely believing in his line of questioning, didn't back down. Instead, he doubled down with a follow-up that would prove to be a critical mistake. "But surely you can't deny that there's a difference between artistic expression and what some might call gratuitous violence," Colbert pressed. "When young people watch your movies, don't you think there's some responsibility to consider how that might influence their worldview?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Tarantino's relaxed posture stiffened, and his famous quick wit was replaced by something much more dangerous, genuine anger. The director leaned forward in his chair, his voice taking on a harder edge that longtime observers of his interviews would recognize as a warning sign. "You know what, Stephen? I'm getting really tired of this sanctimonious." Tarantino shot back, his voice rising slightly. "You sit there in your suit and tie cracking jokes about politicians and current events. But when a real artist comes on your show, you decide to lecture them about responsibility. Where was your sense of responsibility when you were making jokes about serious issues that affect real people's lives?" The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was no longer the playful back and forth they expected from late-night television. The mood in the room had changed completely, and it was clear that something had gone badly wrong. Colbert, clearly caught off guard by the intensity of Tarantino's response, tried to regain control with his usual deflecting humor. "Well, I think there's a difference between comedy and no, there isn't." Tarantino cut in, his voice now ringing clearly throughout the studio. "You don't get to decide what counts as appropriate art and what doesn't. You don't get to sit there judging my work while hiding behind some fake moral high ground. You want to talk about influence? Let's talk about how your show teaches people that complex issues can be reduced to punchlines and cheap applause." The confrontation escalated rapidly, and crew members could be seen shifting nervously behind the cameras. Colbert's face flushed as he realized his attempt at damage control had backfired spectacularly. His trademark smugness began to crack, revealing something far uglier underneath. Instead of trying to de-escalate, he made the fatal choice to match Tarantino's intensity with his own brand of condescension. "Listen, Quentin, I think you're being a little dramatic," Colbert said, his voice dripping with the dismissive tone that had earned him enemies throughout his career. "We're just talking about accountability and entertainment. If you can't handle legitimate questions about your work, maybe you're not as confident in your artistic choices as you pretend to be." The studio audience gasped audibly. Even those unfamiliar with Tarantino's temperament could sense that Colbert had crossed a line, one that should never be crossed with any artist, especially one of Tarantino's stature. The director's eyes flashed with the fury that made his earlier anger seem mild. "Excuse me," Tarantino said quietly, his voice now controlled and dangerous. "Did you just question my confidence in my own work? Did you just suggest I can't handle criticism?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Stephen, I've been making movies since before you figured out how to read a teleprompter without looking like a deer in headlights. I've taken criticism from people far more intelligent and insightful than you could ever hope to be." Nearby, a production assistant frantically gestured toward the control booth, clearly hoping someone would intervene and salvage what had become a public relations disaster. But it was too late. Colbert's bruised ego drove him to dig even deeper. "Well, if you're such a seasoned professional, you should be able to talk about your work without throwing a tantrum like a child," he sneered. "This is exactly the behavior people expect from someone who makes violent movies for a living. Maybe the violence in your films says more about your character than your artistic vision." The words lingered in the air like poison. Several audience members gasped, and someone whispered, "Oh no," into the stunned silence. Tarantino's face shifted from shock to disbelief, then hardened into a cold, calculating anger that was genuinely unsettling. "You want to make this personal?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying to every corner of the studio. "You want to attack my character? Let's talk about character, Stephen. Let's talk about a host who invites guests onto his show just to ambush them with gotcha questions meant to make himself feel superior. Let's talk about someone who built an entire career mocking people who are actually trying to create something meaningful." He rose from his chair, towering over the seated host, his hands shaking with barely restrained rage. "Sit behind that desk every night, making jokes about people doing real work in the world, while you contribute nothing to the cultural conversation except cheap laughs and self-righteous grandstanding. And you have the nerve to question my character? The camera operators kept filming, though it was obvious they were uncomfortable with what they were capturing. This was no longer entertainment. It was a public evisceration unfolding in real time. Colbert, perhaps realizing too late that he had gone too far, tried to backtrack with a weak smile. Now, Quentin, I think we're both getting a little heated here. Maybe we should. No, Tarantino's voice thundered through the studio, cutting off the host's feeble attempt at reconciliation. You don't get to start this fight and then try to play peacemaker when you realize you're losing. You questioned my integrity as an artist and as a person. You suggested that my life's work reflects some moral failing on my part. That's not journalism, Stephen. That's character assassination disguised as entertainment. The director began pacing behind his chair, his agitation growing with every word. You know what the real problem is here? It's hosts like you who think having a television show gives you the right to pass moral judgment on people who actually create art. You're not a critic, you're not a philosopher, and you're certainly not qualified to lecture anyone about responsibility or character. Members of the studio audience were visibly uncomfortable. Some shifted in their seats, while others pulled out their phones, instinctively sensing they were witnessing a moment destined to go viral. The energy in the room had turned toxic, with both men locked in a battle of egos neither seemed willing to abandon. Colbert's face faded from red to pale, sweat forming on his forehead. He was clearly out of his depth, having expected his usual formula of provocative questions followed by witty banter to work as it had with countless other guests. Instead, he faced someone unwilling to play by the unspoken rules of late-night television. Someone prepared to call out the host's behavior in front of a live audience. I think you're overreacting to what was meant to be a thoughtful discussion, Colbert stammered, his usual confidence completely shattered. His words only seemed to fuel Tarantino's anger further, setting the stage for an even more explosive continuation. Thoughtful discussion. Tarantino laughed incredulously, his voice bordering on manic. You call that ambush journalism, masquerading as intellectual discourse, thoughtful? Stephen, you wouldn't recognize a thoughtful discussion if it walked up and introduced itself to you. Kay, he leaned forward, planting both hands on Colbert's desk, his face inches from the trembling host. What you just did is like inviting someone to dinner and then spending the entire meal telling them their cooking is poison. The studio lights seemed to burn hotter as the tension reached unbearable levels. Several audience members had their phones out, recording what they knew would be replayed millions of times across social media. The production crew exchanged panicked glances, but no one dared intervene in what had become a full-scale public humiliation. Colbert's hands shook visibly as he reached for his water glass, his Adam's apple bobbing as he struggled to swallow. Quentin, I think maybe we should take a commercial break. No commercial break. Tarantino slammed his palms onto the desk with such force that Colbert's note cards scattered across the floor. You started this public execution, and now you're going to sit there and finish it like a man. You don't get to hide behind commercials when your cheap shot backfires. The director's face was flushed with fury, his eyes blazing with the intensity of someone pushed beyond all reasonable limits. You want to know what's really violent, Stephen? What's really damaging to society? It's hosts like you who destroy people's reputations for entertainment. It's the way you sit behind that desk like some moral authority while tearing down. Artists who spent their lives perfecting their craft, members of the band, watched in horror from their corner of the stage, instruments forgotten. One guitarist could be seen mouthing holy to the drummer, while the keyboard player buried his face in his hands. Colbert made one final, desperate attempt to regain control of his show. Look, if I've offended you in some way, that wasn't my intention. I was simply trying to engage with the broader cultural conversation about... Shut up, Tarantino's roar tore through the studio with such force that several people in the front row visibly flinched. Just shut your lying mouth for once in your pathetic career. You weren't engaging with anything except your own ego and your desperate need to feel superior to people who actually matter in this industry. The director began circling the desk like a predator stalking wounded prey, his movements slow, deliberate, and threatening. You know what the difference is between you and me, Stephen? When I create violence, it's clearly labeled as fiction. When you destroy someone's character on national television, you call it comedy and hide behind audience applause. Colbert's face had gone ashen, beads of sweat clearly visible on his forehead under the harsh studio lights. His trademark smirk was gone, replaced by something close to genuine fear as he realized what his arrogance had unleashed. Every night, you sit behind that desk, mocking people who are trying to make a difference. Tarantino continued, his voice shifting into a preacher-like cadence that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier shouting. Politicians, artists, activists, anyone who dares to stand for something meaningful becomes fodder for your shallow jokes and your audience's programmed laughter. The studio fell into a crushing silence, broken only by Tarantino's voice and the faint whir of cameras still recording every brutal second. Even the usually reactive audience remained frozen, sensing they were witnessing something far beyond the limits of normal television spectacle. But tonight, Stephen, you picked the wrong target, Tarantino said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt more dangerous than all his shouting. You thought you could ambush me like you've ambushed countless others who were too polite or too afraid to call you out. You were wrong. He straightened, smoothing his jacket with slow, calculated movements. You want to know what real violence looks like? It's what you just did to professional courtesy and basic human decency. It's the way you tried to assassinate my character in front of millions just to feed your own massive ego. Colbert opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. His face had turned gray, his hands gripping the edge of the desk so tightly his knuckles were white. The man known for never being at a loss for words had been rendered completely speechless by someone he had badly underestimated. I've been in this business for over 3 decades, Tarantino went on, his voice now cold and controlled. I've dealt with critics, protesters, censors, and every other person who thinks they know better than I do about my own work. But never, not once, have I encountered someone with the audacity to invite me onto their show just to publicly disrespect me and everything I've worked for. He took a step back, his eyes never leaving Colbert's terrified face. Congratulations, Stephen. You've accomplished something remarkable. You've managed to make yourself look like a complete amateur in front of your own audience, on your own show, with your own cameras rolling. The audience sat in stunned silence, witnessing what would surely become one of the most talked about moments in late-night television history. Some had stopped recording, too absorbed by the raw intensity unfolding before them. Others kept filming, instinctively aware they were capturing something that would be analyzed for years. Tarantino adjusted his tie with precise calm, his movements now eerily composed in stark contrast to the fury he had unleashed moments earlier. The shift was unsettling, like a storm collapsing into sudden stillness. When he spoke again, his voice carried finality. You know what the most pathetic part of all this is, Stephen? He asked, his tone almost friendly, which only made his words sharper. You actually thought you were clever. You thought you could trap me with your little gotcha questions and make yourself look like some intellectual heavyweight. He paused. Instead, you've shown everyone watching that you're nothing more than a glorified bully with a television show. Colbert sat frozen in his chair, his mouth slightly open, looking like a man who had just watched his entire career collapse in real time. Sweat darkened his shirt collar. His usually immaculate hair was disheveled from repeatedly running his hands through it during the confrontation. The confident, smirking persona that had defined his public image was gone, replaced by the hollow shell of someone who had been thoroughly and publicly humiliated. Behind the cameras, the production team stood helpless, unsure whether to keep filming or cut to commercial. From the booth above the studio floor, the show's director could be seen urgently speaking into his headset, almost certainly relaying frantic instructions from network executives, watching in disbelief as their star host unraveled on live television. Tarantino started toward the edge of the stage, then stopped and turned back one last time to face Colbert. "I want you to remember this moment, Stephen," he said, his voice carrying across the silent studio. "Remember what it feels like when someone with real talent and integrity refuses to let you get away with cheap, cowardly attacks. That's what real courage looks like, not hiding behind a desk, making jokes about people who aren't there to defend themselves." He took a few more steps toward the exit, paused again, and added, "And next time you want to have a thoughtful discussion about violence and entertainment, maybe you should look in the mirror first. What you did tonight was more brutal than anything I've ever put on screen. At least my violence serves a purpose in telling a story. Yours was just sadistic entertainment at someone else's expense." The silence that followed was so absolute that the hum of the studio equipment sounded deafening. Tarantino gave a single nod equal parts dismissal and pity, then turned and walked off the stage with the composed bearing of someone who had just demonstrated how to respond to professional disrespect. As his footsteps faded backstage, the reality of what had happened slowly sank in. Colbert remained motionless, staring at the spot where Tarantino had stood, his face locked in shock and humiliation. The audience shifted uneasily, unsure whether to clap, boo, or remain silent, sensing that someone had to break the unbearable tension. The bandleader began playing the show's outro music. Though even that familiar sound felt awkward and out of place, Colbert mechanically turned toward the camera, his movements stiff and uncertain, but no words came out. For what felt like an eternity, though it was likely only half a minute, viewers watched as one of television's most assured hosts sat speechless behind his own desk. Finally, the show cut to commercial, but the damage was already irreversible. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation flooded social media, quickly amassing millions of views and igniting widespread debates about professionalism, respect, and the responsibilities of talk show hosts. The incident marked a turning point, not only for Colbert's career, but for late-night television as a whole. Audiences who had grown accustomed to hosts ambushing guests for viral moments began questioning whether that brand of entertainment was entertaining at all. In the days that followed, ratings for The Late Show fell sharply as viewers either tuned out in disgust or disengaged after losing respect for a host so decisively overwhelmed by his own guest. Industry insiders spent weeks dissecting how a seasoned television professional could have misjudged the situation so badly. More than anything, the confrontation served as a reminder that behind the polished personas and scripted banter of late night television are real people with real achievements and dignity that deserve respect. Quentin Tarantino had walked on stage as a guest and left as someone who refused to be diminished by cynicism, masquerading as wit and cruelty disguised as comedy. The entertainment world would not soon forget the night a celebrated filmmaker reminded everyone what it means to stand up for artistic integrity and personal dignity under the harshest public spotlight.